Hello James class, this is week 13. This week we're looking at Miguel de la Torre's book, Reading the Bible from the Margins, and specifically thinking about how that affects the way we read the Epistle of James, and how we think about exegesis, how we think about biblical interpretation as biblical interpretation from and for the margins. Let's use Miguel de la Torre's 4 premises to help us think this thing through. Premise number 1. On page 2 of his book, he says that not all biblical interpretations are true and authoritative. Not all biblical interpretations are true and authoritative. Now, at first glance, this doesn't seem like such a big deal for him to say. We all kind of agree that not all biblical interpretations are true and authoritative. We might disagree with which ones we think are and which ones we think aren't, but we don't tend to disagree with the statement that biblical interpretations aren't always true or aren't always authoritative. However, the other side of this is that all of us are in the business, or are planning to be in the business, of teaching and preaching from these biblical texts as authorities, as pastors, as teachers, as preachers, as professors. So what makes our interpretation authoritative or not authoritative? What makes our interpretation true or not true? Those are the sorts of questions that Miguel de la Torre's first statement should raise within us. Are we reading in a way that's authoritative? Are we reading in a way that's true? And how do we know that to be the case? Argument 2 that de la Torre raises is that we all address the biblical texts from our own social location. We all read the biblical texts and interpret the biblical texts from our own social location. So de la Torre would say that most interpretation is autobiographical and no interpretation is objective. That is, no interpretation is purely without any kind of bias whatsoever, just the facts and only the facts. He would say what facts you see has everything to do with who's doing the looking. Those who are looking from one perspective may not see the perspective of others looking from a different place, from a different social location. Now, the difficulty with this premise for us is, as we think about what kind of interpretations are true and authoritative, that we have been trained to think of our ability to read the text truly, to be able to read the text objectively, to be able to read the text in an unbiased fashion, just scientifically not reading into the text. But what de la Torre is arguing is there is no such reading. We all read the text with bias. We all read the text from a particular location. Now, we don't always read the texts from our own location. We have often been trained to read the text from someone else's location. We have often been trained, de la Torre argues, to read the text from the perspective of the dominant culture. If we are people of color, to read the text from the perspective of white people, white European people. If we are women, to read the text from the perspective of men. If we are gay, to read the text from the perspective of people who are straight. If we are poor, to read the text from the perspective of those who are rich. But de la Torre says a true interpretation is one that's autobiographical. So what does it mean for us to read the text from our own social location? If we are women, to read the text as women and not just to excuse things that are in the text that are oppressive to women. If we aren't rich, to read the text as someone who is poor and not to just excuse those things that might be putting the poor down, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, all of us also come from another location, which is denominational. Almost all of you are either AME or Baptist. There's some Presbyterians out there. I've seen some CMEs out there. I know there's a CME presiding elder out there. I'm expecting there's probably a Pentecostal or two out there, maybe a UMC out there. All of which is to say you also come from another location, which is denominational. And your denominational location also has a way in which it understands things to be true and authoritative. What if your denominational perspective clashes with your race or your class or your gender or your sexuality in how you read the text? Which of those prevails? This then begins to unpack just how tricky it is to give an interpretation that's autobiographical and thus is true as well as authoritative. And this is part of what it means to read for yourself from the margins. Argument 3 is for Miguel de la Torre, and that's kind of the crux of his argument. The Bible must be read through the eyes of the disenfranchised. The Bible must be read through the eyes of the disenfranchised. So it's not just that you have to read it autobiographically. You've got to read it autobiographically, but also take seriously the lens of those who have no power, no franchise. And Miguel de la Torre names 4 particular kinds of disenfranchisement. He names systemic racism. Systemic racism not just being, I don't like you because you're black, but I have the power to get privilege because I am not black that you do not have because you are black, and I participate in that system and I don't challenge that system. He names racism. He also names sexism, which is the same kind of a systemic analysis. I am participating in a system of sexism and don't challenge it, which a lot of men are in. That's the kind of place a lot of men are in, particularly men in the pulpit. Heterosexism, which many of us share. We are straight people. We don't have to think about the impact of what it means to be able to love who we want to love and marry who we want to marry, and have the government and the community recognize those things and not have to worry about having ourselves killed for walking hand in hand with the one we love. And then classism, which is a big issue. This is the issue right now on the ground. This is what's occupying the Occupy movement around the country, the 99%, those who have no money. What does it mean to read the Bible from their perspective? So what does it mean to read the Bible from the margins? Well, there are 2 ways you can get at this. Number 1 is to do what De La Torre does, which is to go find writers from those groups and read them. And that's a very honest way to do it, because you're letting other people speak for themselves. And so those of you who are reading Elsa Tamez's book are reading a Latina American woman's reading of James. Those of you who are reading Kate Hope Felder's book are reading an African American perspective. Pedrito Maynard Reed is actually a Jamaican, and you're reading a Jamaican perspective on James. On reserve in the library, I think for Dr. Bailey's class, is the Queer Bible Commentary. If you want to see a gay and lesbian perspective on James, you might go check out the Queer Bible Commentary and read what it has to say about James. All of these are ways to begin to get at how do people on the margins read. A second way to get at that is to use what I think Dr. Lomax calls your holy or your sanctified imagination. Read this text as though you were not rich. Read this text as though you were female. Read this text as though you were non-white or not the majority ethnicity. Read this text as though you were gay or lesbian, as though you were not the majority sexuality. What does James sound like when it's read that way? How is James heard when it is read from those lenses? What if, and then think about being multiply mixed. Think about being a black lesbian woman of color who has no money. Think about being a poor lesbian woman of color. Think about someone who has a mix of enfranchisement, a rich black man who is straight, or a rich lesbian of color. What does it mean to read the text when you have both power and disenfranchisement within the community system? So this is one of the ways to read it. You can also pick up the remote, follow the news, pick one of these issues and just follow it for the next week and look at James in light of those issues. Look at the Occupy Wall Street movement if you want to look at the poor. Look at the question of migrant laborers or look at the question of the sexual scandal going on in Penn State right now in terms of children being raped and how that affects children. Look at the ways in which, just look up beaten up for being gay and see how many times you see people being beaten and killed this week for being gay. It won't be in the mainline press, it'll be in the sub-presses, because the mainline press doesn't cover it, but people are beaten up and killed all the time just for being gay. You know, look at the issues of race and racism. Look at the way in which race and racism is defined and depicted in the media. Look at the way African Americans are depicted by the Ann Coulters of the world and by the Republicans who are saying that this is a real black person, this is not a real black person. So look at those things and then read James again and see if James speaks to you differently when you're reading through those lenses. And then think about this word justice. And this is a conversation that the De La Torre has on about 145, 146 of his book, where he talks about what justice means and what justice looks like. The word justice is always translated, almost always translated in our Bibles, righteousness. Because the Greek word dikaiosune, which is justice in every other language, became righteousness in English. It's a long story of how that came to be. Some of it has to do with the fact that English wasn't yet a settled language when the Bible was translated. At any rate, we don't read dikaiosune as the word it originally meant, which is justice. And so we hear things differently from other people. If you were Spanish and reading James, you would read in James 1:20, human anger does not produce God's justice. Not God's righteousness, God's justice. In James 2:23, you would understand that Abraham's act of loyalty to God, offering Isaac, was counted to him as justice. Not as righteousness, as justice. And then in 3:18, that you would have learned that a harvest of justice, not righteousness, justice, is sown in peace for those who make peace. Well, how does that understanding of what justice looks like affect the way we read James? Finally, De La Torre's fourth argument, that reading the Bible from the margins liberates those who are oppressed and those who are oppressors. Liberates those who are oppressed and those who are oppressors. What are we liberating ourselves from? And what are we liberating ourselves to? In order to head toward freedom, you've got to have an idea of what freedom means. It's not just that freedom is not this, but freedom looks like that. What does freedom look like? And how does reading James from the margin liberate those who are on the margins and liberate those who might be oppressors? How might the rich be liberated by James? How might men be liberated by James? How might straight people be liberated by James? How might people who are not black or brown or yellow be liberated by reading James? How might those who are on the outsides of our churches be liberated by reading James? What is it that James does to set people free? And do we want liberation? Or do we participate in, collude with, and get so much out of the oppression that has systemically been in this society that we side with the oppressors even in how we read the Bible? These are important questions. And these are very, very important questions for you to think about, not just in your exegesis paper, but going forward in your ministry. Do you side with the oppressors when you read the Bible? Do you read the Bible like a straight white man with power and money? Are you a straight black white man with power and money? Is that the group of people to whom God is calling you to serve? Are those people really as free as they think they are? What does it mean for us to live into Jesus' proclamation? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for God has called me to preach justice. I'll see you in the forums.